Hey everyone, welcome to my series on JavaScript and jQuery programming, and today's session is on objects. So we're going to discuss what are objects, what are keys and methods in an object, and how to loop through those keys and how to bind events to an object. So let's begin. Okay, so let's start by defining an object. Now an object is a collection of properties and methods which are associated with that object. Now let's consider an object with the name book. Now this is an instance of that object. A book can have a property like name. Suppose the name of the book is Sumehit Programming Tutorials. We have number of pages property, which is, let's say, 100. We have the author property, which is, let's say, Sumehit Programming Team. Then we have the topics discussed property, or let's say topics property, whereas we have the topics RP and scripting, which are discussed in that book. And then there could be methods associated with that object. So a book object can have methods like publish, it can have methods like sold out, and things like that. So an object is just a collection of properties and methods which are associated with that object. Now how to use that object? So let me start by defining an object like this. So what I've done here is I have also put a text area in my HTML page. Let me just go back to the HTML. So whatever output I'm going to discuss, the output is going to be displayed in this text area. So let's start by displaying the name property of that object. So this is how we display a property of that object. So our object name is book, and the property we are going to display is name, and this is the name that should come out in that text area. So let's save it, go back to our browser and refresh it, and we see that our name of the book, Sumehit Programming Tutorials, has been displayed. The other way of doing the same thing is to use square brackets, and inside that use the property as a literal, as a string. Save it, go back to our and refresh that, and it remains same. Let's just change that to author. Save it, go back and refresh, and it says Sumehit Programming Team, who's the author for the book. So this is how you can refer to properties of an object by either using the dot method, where we directly use the property name like this, or maybe let's just go with the number of pages, which is 100, or we can go with the square brackets notation with the property name as a string. Now let's look at properties which are actually a collection of strings. For example, this property topics is a collection of multiple strings. So how do we do that? How do we loop through those values? Let's look at this. So we have a property here called topics, which is essentially an array of two strings, RPA and scripting. Now if we just remove this notation and just put a dot and the property name, which is topics, and output this to our text area, it should ideally convert this array internally into a comma separated string. So let's see how it works. We have saved it, go back to our browser and refresh, and you see that both the values of an array are getting converted into a comma separated string. The entire array is getting displayed as a comma separated string. So this is how we can display array properties of a object. And as we discussed before, we can achieve the same thing by using a square bracket notation and mentioning topics right here. Save, go back to our page, refresh the page, and the value remains same. Now let's see how to invoke the functions inside the object. So let's try to invoke the publish function first. So now instead of doing this, I'm just going to invoke the publish function of that object. Save it, go back to the browser and refresh the browser, and says book published. So why does it do that? So if you see, the public function has been defined as a function which executes by assigning the string book published to our variable out to text box, which is getting assigned to this text area control. and that is how we invoke the publish function. Now in the same way, if we invoke the sold out function, go back and refresh, and it says book sold out. So this is how we can invoke functions or methods associated with an object. Now let's try to write a function to loop through the different elements of this array or this collection using a very important keyword while discussing objects called this. So let's see how that works. What we are going to do is we are going to write a new function or method called list topics, and define this function by saying this dot, so our collection name is topics, and we're going to use the for each function, and I'm going to use the arrow notation, and in that we're going to write our variable, let's say auto text box. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign each value to the auto text box variable and keep appending it with a new line character so that it comes in a new line. Basically we're just trying to display all these values of this collection, each value in a different line. So let me just increase few more values over here. We have RPA, we have scripting, we have let's say web designing, let's put core Java over here, and let's put .NET over here. Save it. Okay, so what are we doing here? So we have defined a function called list topics by saying that this function is basically looping through the topics property of this. So what is this? So whenever we say this, we are actually referring to the current instance of this object. So when we say this, it means the book object, and inside the book object we are referring to the topics property, which is a collection. So that's why we're going to run the for each loop on that, and for each value we're going to assign that value or append that value to the out to text box variable, and then separate that with a new line character so it comes in a new line, right? Every value comes in a new line. Now this out to text box is inside the scope, so we're basically defining a function, and within that function we are using that out to text box. Okay, let's just run this and see. So once we invoke this by calling list to topics over here, ideally we should get the elements of this array in each element in a new line in the text area. Let's see. So we come back to our page and we refresh the page, and okay, there is an error. I think the variable scope is limited to this function. Let me just declare the variable outside. And refresh this, and rightly so, all the elements of that array is now coming in a new line inside the text area, just as we expected. So this is how we can use the this keyword to access any property or method for that particular instance of the object. So in this case we have used the, instead of saying book.topics, we are saying this.topics to access the current instance of the book object, and then using the for each loop we are looping through each value of that topics array by using the arrow notation, and we are appending that value to our text area variable. So this is how we use the this keyword. Now let's see how we can update a property of the object. So the notation is going to be same. We just write book dot, let's say we're going to update let's say the topics property. So we say topics and equal to, let's just remove a topic from this list. So instead of all these topics, I'm just going to remove these two topics and just keep three topics: RPA, scripting, and web designing. And we're going to again use the same list topics to list out the topics right here. So I have removed these two. Let's just see if it works. I have saved this and go back to the browser and refresh, and as we expected, we have removed the two additional topics and just kept RPS, scripting and web designing. So similarly, we can update the value of any property by using the same notation. So let's say this, I can just put new name over here, and I'll just assign this to our variable right here, and as you can guess, the new name comes right here. So this is how we can update any value of a object property. Now let's see how to loop through all the properties of this object. So our earlier loop was basically through the elements of this particular property of the object, but now we are going to loop through each property of an object. So let's just reuse the same function, list topics. I'm just going to remove the contents from here, and inside that I'm going to use a for loop, and I'm going to say variable prop in this. So like we already saw, this refers to the current instance of the object. Now I'm just going to put an alert over here to pop out the value in prop. Let's see what comes. Let me just remove this, and let's just remove this and call the list topics function. Go back to our page and refresh the page, and the first pop-up says name, the second pop-up says number of pages, then author, topics, publish, sold out, list topics. So what just happened? Every property name, the name of each property including the name of the functions, got popped up. So when we did a for loop for each property in this, and this variable was used in the alert function, the name of each of the properties was displayed in the message box. But now how do we actually display each value of each of these properties? Can we use this dot prop? No, we cannot use this. Let's see what happens. Let me just use this dot prop and go back and refresh, and it says undefined, and it continues to say undefined for every iteration of the loop. In this case we have to use the square bracket notation, because our properties prop is not exactly a property. Prop is a variable inside which the name of the property is stored. So name, number of pages, author, topics, publish, these are the name of the properties and methods which is going to be stored in this variable. So we need to use the square bracket notation. And now when we alert this, the values of each of these properties and methods is going to be displayed. Let's see how that works. So we refresh this, and the first value is Sumihite Programming Tutorials, which is the name of our book. So it's basically the value of the name property. Then 100 is the value of a number of pages property. Then similarly all the other properties, the values of those properties are getting displayed. So this is how we can use a loop to loop through each of the properties of that particular properties or methods of that particular object, including its values. Okay, so now let's have a look at the bind method, how the binding works. So in order to do that, let's just shift to jQuery and keep the entire object construct same. We don't need to change that, and we just need to put our document.ready over here, function start, cut that from here and paste it here. So the entire thing is now under a jQuery construct. Save it, and what we're going to do here is remove the loop and just alert this dot topics, right? So the list topics method is just going to pop up the list of all the topics, and that should work. I don't see a problem. Go back to our page and refresh the page, and you see that all the topics are getting listed. So since it's an array and we are doing an implicit conversion of toString, so it's just coming out as a comma separated string, right? RPA, scripting, web designing, core, Java and .NET. Click OK, come back. Now To explain the bind method, what we're going to do is we are going to introduce a button over here, input type button. Let's put an ID to this button, let's say btn, and let's put a value saying click me. Done. Now what's going to happen is the list topics method is not directly going to invoke this pop-up. It's going to wait for the button click. So inside this we're going to do $pound btn, that's the ID of the button, dot click, and then inside this we're going to have this function defined, and this function will contain the pop-up. Close the function right here. Done. So what we're going to do is invoke the list topics, which is basically going to define the click event, and in that click event we're going to have this alert. And let's see what happens. Go back, refresh, the button comes right here. So on refresh nothing happens, but on click me the topic should have come, but it says undefined. Why does it say undefined? Now this is supposed to this keyword is supposed to refer to the current scope or the current object, right? But we need to understand that by saying btn.click and defining a function, we are in an anonymous function, or we're in a different scope here. So we need to bind this function to that object instance that we're talking about. So how to do that? In order to do that, we need to put a dot over here right after the ending curly brace of this function, and then we need to say bind parenthesis inside that this. And now if we save it and refresh the page and click me, and we get the same message box again. RPA, scripting, web designing, core Java, and .NET. All the values are coming. So this is how we use the bind with the this operator. So this is how we use objects in JavaScript and jQuery. We have seen how to loop through a particular collection. We have seen how to loop through the properties of an object, and we have seen how to use the bind with this keyword. Just try it out on your own and let me know if you face any issues in the comment section. I'll be happy to help you out. Thank you.